Hello, welcome to Origin Story. In each episode, we take an idea, figure, or event from history. We explain its origins, and we talk about how it influences political discourse today. I'm Dorian Linsky, author of Everything Must Go and the Ministry of Truth.
And I am Ian Dunt. I am the author of How to Be a Liberal. Why not? That's the most pertinent book for what we're discussing. It's very
pertinent. And together we write the Origin Story books, also pertinent. It's a pertinence fest. This is part 2 of the story of Lenin, Trotsky and Stalin, Power. The period between the Russian Revolution and the establishment of Stalin's dictatorship. So, Ian, everyone agrees that between 1917 and the early 30s, the dream of communism as the liberation of the masses degenerates into tyranny. But they don't agree at all on when.
Yeah, that's right, isn't it? But I think that's because of this laundering process with Lenin and Trotsky. Pretty much everyone's on board the Stalin is a dick train. I mean, it's quite rare that you find someone that isn't, and they're noticeable for it. There's a much stronger rearguard defense for Lenin, and particularly for Trotsky, who still, to this day has quite a lot of people who try to shore up his reputation. Lenin is the one that there's a real moral imperative, I think, to just demonstrate, people suffered because of this man. Like, they were killed, many people were killed. But even those who weren't killed would have starved or just been forced into a system of such uniformity and conformity, just like such a bludgeoning of the human spirit under this guy, that especially people who sell themselves as quite rebellious, and free thinking and all that. Yeah. And you think, now, you know what? The kind of tyranny that was inflicted on people because of this individuality does need calling out, and his name should be mud on the basis of it.
And some people got it really early and some people much later. I think it's really telling that in Animal Farm, everything has a real world analog except Lenin. There's no Lenin figure. So Old Major, the original revolutionary, is like a hybrid of Marx and Lenin. They're not distinguished. So it's sort of...
Right.
Because Orwell wasn't quite sure. At certain points he thought, things would have been very different. Lenin was much better. And then around the time Animal Farm comes out, he writes a letter to a friend and he goes, actually, no, I think, the dictatorship was already in place then. But he took quite a long time, this is until 1945, to sort of...
Jesus Christ.
...come to that conclusion.
I didn't know that was a result of his uncertainty.
I assume it's the result of his uncertainty. The uncertainty is real, and it's true that there is not a clear Lenin analog in there. So I feel that this was something that a lot of people were wrestling with. Maybe it's a little harder to understand why people would wrestle with it today, but it certainly was something people wrestled with at the time. And it's really interesting seeing the people that were kind of right out of the gate like, oh no, this is what we wanted.
Well, because this is the moment, right? Like this moment that we're here after all these episodes. Finally, now they're in charge. Socialists are in charge. They've got a country, and they proceed to do a series of things that you would expect them to do, and that the ideology would have instructed them to do. To eradicate private property, to take over the means of production, to establish socialism. And yet the things that follow were very much not what was predicted would take place. And there are, for instance, it will not surprise anyone to learn that we do not see the universal brotherhood of man take place over the course of these episodes.
Because of counter-revolutionaries.
Yes, exclusively so. It's basically Churchill's fault. So the question then becomes why did that happen? And in some cases, it's because of the socialist ideas themselves, not Marxist necessarily, but the socialist ideas that we will have been covering for episodes now, some of which are quite unexpected, like the destruction of the family, for instance, which rears its head again here. In other cases, it will be because of the school of socialism that these guys were picking from. For instance, the much more terrorist-inclined Blanqui school rather than the more kind of hedonistic and humanistic Fourier school. All of this is in our first episode. And in others, it's just because of the circumstances. It's like they had a revolution in exactly the place that Marx was like, you're not going to have a revolution there. And once it does take place there in conditions where there is no bursting productive forces, where there isn't a situation of plenty and of a built capitalist infrastructure, you start to see some very negative repercussions indeed.
I think we mentioned the movie Reds last time. And, one of the, what's really exciting is just when they enter the Winter Palace, the October Revolution. And I think it's really important to sort of just bear in mind that excitement, that liberation. It's just like the people are in charge now, because that's the essence of the tragedy. It wasn't like a fascist coup. It wasn't like Pinochet. and immediately just like executing his enemies or whatever. It was something that was meant to be relatively peaceful and was meant to be, very sort of joyful. And now everything's going to be different. And so just to sort of hold that in mind as they move on.
It's also worth saying, that there are elections. There's one election that takes place shortly after the revolution. And people are voting for, socialist revolutionary parties, not necessarily the Bolsheviks, but broadly for this kind of, approach towards politics. It's not like this is an unpopular approach among large sections of the population, although very clearly, as we'll see, not all of it.
Yeah, but the Bolsheviks themselves,
much lower support.
Not so popular. I mean, they start from a really quite weak position. The party membership has shot up to 200,000, but it's a population of 125 million. Mm-hmm. So it's still quite a niche concern, probably mainly in like Petrograd and Moscow. So they do need to hit the ground running and bring this radical change and establish power and, just show they mean business. So there's a series of decrees right away, which is sort of some of which you would expect. Decree on the 8-hour day, great. Decree on popular education, great. This is what socialists were demanding all across Europe. Decree on the separation of church and state. Decree on land abolishes private ownership. Decree on workers' control. And then there's a whole thing about the Declaration of the Rights of the Peoples of Russia, where Lenin initially was really quite sympathetic to national groupings and not wanting to impose Russian ethnicity on all of the others. And they let go of various parts of the Russian Empire, like Poland and Finland, and offer other nations the right to secede on the assumption that they won't want to, which is extremely confident. So you've got some kind of you've got some positive things happening. A lot of these policies are very popular. But like you said, in that first election for the Constituent Assembly, they only win like a quarter of the votes.
Yeah.
And their response
is not great. I mean, the socialist revolutionaries get 40% of the votes. The Bolsheviks, like you're saying, concentrated in the urban areas, socialist revolutionaries in the more rural areas. And, these are broadly similar parties, although obviously that doesn't stop the Bolsheviks rounding them up and imprisoning them later. This promise of the elections had been made by the provisional government. It had been made, after that initial sort of February Revolution. And saying, look, we're going to create an assembly, basically a sort of normal parliament. We're going to come up with a constitution for Russia, and this will be the start of a new kind of liberal democratic sort of era. The Bolsheviks were very passionately for it when they were in opposition,
Sure.
when they weren't in power. But there's a point, it's very early, it's October the 10th, 1917, where Lenin secretly turns against it. And he turns against it because he realizes that it's not going to support the Bolsheviks.
Oh, right. So he knows this 2 weeks before the revolution.
Exactly. So he says, to wait for the Constituent Assembly, which will obviously not be with us, is senseless and will make our task harder. It's very revealing, right? That for all of this stuff of the vanguard of the proletariat, and there's kind of a recognition of the public aren't actually with us. If they were, we would be very confident going into this election.
What surprises me is that the public is still not with them after the revolution. You think the revolution would change things a lot? People go, well, now the Bolsheviks seem to be in charge, so let's vote for the Bolsheviks. But that's not really what happens.
No, exactly right. So the Socialist Revolution is 40%, the Bolsheviks 24% on 60% turnout. And that's when Lenin starts saying, oh, you know what, actually, these Soviets that we mentioned last time, these kind of, these places for workers to gather and debate, they're a, quote, higher form of democracy than bourgeois capitalist democracy, as the assembly is.
Oh, yeah.
So it only meets once in January. It's quite similar to actually when Hitler passed the Enabling Act, just this sense of this aggression and violence towards deputies, towards the people that have been elected. So they try to get in, they throw them out. Whenever they try to speak, they get shouted down. There's soldiers there who raise their rifles to point at anyone that sort of gets up on the stage to say anything. Lenin just walks out of the building. It's overnight, in the early morning. He walks out the building and he says to the soldiers on the way out, there's no need to disperse the Constituent Assembly. Just let them go on chattering as long as they like and then break up. And tomorrow we won't let a single one of them come in.
Yeah, there's no more Constituent Assembly.
And that's no more Constituent Assembly. It's effectively liquidated from that point on.
And worth remembering, and this is quite a familiar story in history, that, New Year's Day, 1918, there was an assassination attempt by monarchists, which is one of the things he uses as a pretext for the seizure of power and dissolving parliament. And Trotsky as well. Good old Trotsky, the nice one, says as soon as they seize power, there's no going back. We're introducing the dictatorship of the proletariat.
Well, this is it.
Like they don't, there are the pretexts. They're like, well, we've got all this opposition from abroad and from, monarchists inside Russia. And yet, not even from day one, long before the revolution, they're already saying, yeah, we're going to establish a dictatorship. So they don't really need the excuses. They're just helpful.
Here's Trotsky on the end of the Constituent Assembly. The deputies brought candles with them in case the Bolsheviks cut off the electric light, and a vast number of sandwiches in case their food be taken from them. Thus, democracy entered upon the struggle with dictatorship, heavily armed with sandwiches and candles. It's classic Trotsky, right? It's funny, it's eloquent, it's journalistic, and it is utterly cynical, and supportive of tyranny. That's ultimately what it is. At that point, then, the Bolsheviks just start setting up the infrastructure of their dictatorship. They have a theory of state power, which is that the state should have no legal limitations to what it does. For all of this Marxist talk of, the state will wither away, that is not the approach that's taken at all.
That happens later. We were talking before the episode about how when people, when we're offered certain pieces of work, will you come and do this talk or something? And if it's like 3 months away, you go, yeah, fine, that's in the future. And then as it gets closer, you're like, oh no, I forgot I agreed to that. So that's sort of what the withering away of the state is. If someone goes, is that going to happen eventually? They go, yeah. No, definitely. And then every time someone goes, what about now? And it's like, oh, unfortunately, we're going to have to kick that can down the road.
So there is no real limit to state power, and the state really is based on force. They have a central committee on the Bolsheviks, but it's just way too big. It just becomes incredibly unwieldy. Gregory Zinoviev says in 1919, if it gets any bigger, it will look like, quote, a small mass meeting. So at that point, they decide, okay, so what we need is a political bureau. Mm-hmm. That's the Politburo. And this becomes the kind of central organ of absolute power. That starts to shift later on because even that becomes sort of too representative and democratic. But for the time being, that is the organ of power. As early as the first meeting, March 1919, when it's just passing policy on economics, on religious teaching, on trials, it's evident already that there's basically no legal limit to its powers.
A bit that I must admit, I have to confess some ignorance that sort of shocked me, is that technically Lenin and Stalin were never the heads of state. The head of state, this is a good pub fact, from 1919 to 1946, the head of state was an old Bolshevik called Mikhail Kalinin.
I had no idea.
So technically the head of state, whereas, what we think of as the head of state would be the general secretary of the Communist Party.
Right.
So that's why often Stalin is referred to as like the Soviet premier, like a really vague word, because he's not the president and he's not the prime minister and he's not. It's a very, very very strange structure.
You're effectively like the head of the National Executive Committee of the Labour Party.
Yeah, that's kind of it. Mm. Yeah, because the party is running things, but technically they go, oh, no, there is a head of state. It's just like, you've never heard of him. And literally, he just doesn't appear in like most of the histories of this thing.
That's incredible.
Like a complete irrelevance.
Literally, his name doesn't even ring a bell. Very briefly, Lenin then sets up the basics of what will become the Soviet system of tyranny. There's two parts to that. First part is the secret police, the Cheka. In 1917, they created the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission.
For the struggle with counter-revolution and sabotage.
Wow.
Right away, it's that paranoia thing. It's just like, it's almost like our secret police is a regrettable necessity because of all the people who are out to get us.
And yet, they will be the formulation for the way that the whole of society should be run. Here's Sai Gusev. He's a member of the party's Central Control Commission. Lenin taught us that every member of the party must be an agent of the Cheka. That is, we must watch and inform. We might be the best of friends, but once we start to differ in politics, we must not only break off our friendship, we must go further and start informing. Cheka are given extrajudicial status. They've got the power to arrest, to investigate, to pass sentence, to carry it out. we have no idea how many people these people killed. I mean, we will never know the numbers because tens of thousands of people were just shot without trial in their cellars over the course of the story that we're talking about, let alone those that we do have figures for.
And again, confusingly, they become the OGPU, the GPU, the OGPU, the NKVD, and then the KGB.
Mate, fair enough. You just did that acronym shit straight out by memory. That was fucking I was looking at you like a fucking mastermind or something. I was like, that's very good.
So it's like the name of St. Petersburg / Petrograd / Leningrad. Do you know what I mean? It's just like, what period are we talking about here? And we should say it was originally run by Felix Dzerzhinsky, who was one of Trotsky's exile buddies. So a lot of these people were initially the old Bolsheviks who had been fighting since the 1890s, really.
The second part is the formation of concentration camps, later called Gulag. There's an assassination attempt against Lenin on August the 30th, 1918, at a factory. And this is another point of just seizing on an opportunity, to create this policy of mass terror. A week later, the People's Commissars decree, security of the rear by means of terror is an absolute necessity. It is essential to protect the Soviet Republic from class enemies by isolating them in concentration camps. The Politburo starts approving the building of camps. So, for instance, there's one for 10,000 to 20,000 people in Uta in early 1921. Shortly afterwards, another one in Kolmogorov. Soon they cover the whole map. So obviously, the best book on this is Alexander Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago. And Archipelago is that image of them. There's these dots, some tiny, some huge, just scattered across the whole of the continent, with ultimately millions of people just being processed through those camps. It becomes much larger under Stalin, but they are established in these early stages by Lenin.
So perhaps the most important decree in the very short term is the Decree on Peace, which ends hostilities on the Eastern Front because they are still technically at war with Germany. As the provisional government discovered, you cannot fix the economy or get political stability until you end the war. And the Bolsheviks, it's a really unenviable position. It's a vast, largely rural country. They don't have a lot of popular support out there. Very fragile relationships between the peasants, the industrial working class. They need growth. Go back to our growth episode. They need growth. They need to raise living standards, like Keir Starmer. That's the way to kind of quell this, this unrest.
He also needs peace with Germany.
What, Keir Starmer?
Yes.
Very, very Leninist figure. So Trotsky, who's the Commissar for External Affairs, Foreign Secretary, goes to Brest-Litovsk on the border between Belarus and Poland to negotiate the peace terms. And then the leaders all disagree in very revealing ways about what they should do. Lenin just wants to agree to peace terms, end it straight away. Nikolai Bukharin, who edits Pravda and leads, at this point, the left Bolshevik faction, even though later he is associated with the right opposition.
Yeah, we'll go into some of that, but I promise you not too much of it later.
So he wants to wage a revolutionary war instead, and even considers getting rid of Lenin in order to do this. Quite early doors. Trotsky, who later becomes the first person to really write a piece attacking centrism and how centrists can't make up their mind and are slippery and untrustworthy. He uses the phrase, neither war nor peace.
Wow.
Which is a real third way. So what his plan is, you stall the negotiations to buy time for German socialists to overthrow the German government. And then you're not making peace with imperial Germany at all, but socialist Germany. Stalin, who is still the pragmatist at this point, thinks this is absolute nonsense and just goes there is no revolution coming in the West. Straight away, he's just it's probably just us here. So Trotsky is this amazing character. Robert Service, in his biography, points out probably Trotsky was the most famous Jewish person on earth.
Oh, wow. Yes, that must be true. Yeah.
Because he's foreign minister and a cosmopolitan internationalist, he wants world revolution and he's well-traveled, easily tied to anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about Jews trying to run the world.
God, of course. Yeah.
So right away, you've got anti-Semitism wrapped up with anti-communism and sort of anti-globalism, I guess. So Lenin gets his way, February 1918, when the Central Powers, that's Germany, Austria-Hungary, Ottoman Empire, issue an ultimatum. They say, look, unless you sign a permanent treaty, then we will just resume fighting, which is a good bargaining technique. So the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk is signed. It gives Germany Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, and the Baltic states. And Lenin, meanwhile, tells the Bolsheviks, don't worry, because a socialist Germany is inevitable and they'll just give the land back in a few months. Anyway, the left socialist revolutionaries, right, the ones that haven't been kicked out, the ones that are acceptable to the Bolsheviks, they're the junior partners in the government. They find the treaty so outrageous that they walk out and leave the Bolsheviks in sole charge.
There was a possibility, in those early stages of some kind of like sort of communist pluralism, working with the Mensheviks, working with the socialist revolutionaries. These were ideas that were there that some people wanted to hold. Yeah. And that idea of pluralism finally dies at the point that these guys walk off stage.
So war settled, March 1918, Lenin moves into the Kremlin in Moscow and only now renames the Bolsheviks the Russian Communist Party, according to his new definition of communism as the sort of the final phase after socialism. And he writes a booklet called The Current Tasks of Soviet Power. And I mean, it's sort of mad that anybody thought that he didn't want to be a dictator, because he literally writes in this, dictatorship is iron authority that is revolutionarily audacious as well as rapid and merciless in its suppression of both exploiters and hooligans. I mean, he said the thing.
He has many flaws, but he isn't actually much of a hypocrite when it comes to his rhetoric. He does just keep on saying, this is what I want, this is what I'm doing. And if you're going to say that's not what he is, you really have to be very imaginative indeed. We're
going to do a dictatorship. So Lenin moves Trotsky to military affairs on the assumption that now the war is over, the Red Army won't have much fighting to do. And this is why I was a bit confused, because you, in the last episode, you said, I think rightly, that Lenin did anticipate, that there would be a civil war. But he certainly didn't anticipate it at the right time. Now, the Russian Civil War is insanely complicated. So I will simplify it.
Thank you.
Briefly. Because it's not just the Reds versus the Whites. It's the Reds versus everyone else. And in fact, it starts in May 1918 with a faction of socialist revolutionaries called Kammuch, who seized the Volga region. And it's only in November where you get the White Russians who knock out Kammuch. They're led by Admiral Alexander Kolchak.
And who are they composed of?
This is the monarchists, the anti-Bolsheviks, basically like proto-fascists.
Right.
Kolchak declares himself supreme ruler of all Russia. I mean, they're appallingly anti-Semitic as well. I mean, the White Russians are the people who disseminated the Protocols of the Elders of Zion.
Oh,
a Russian document. They're the ones, as they fled Russia, who brought it into Western Europe. And unbelievably brutal. I mean, Christopher Hitchens suggested actually that if the Whites had won the Civil War, the word we used for fascism might be Russian instead of Italian.
Oh, wow.
Because they're so much like fascists.
Yeah.
Which I thought was a really sharp point. According to one American general who was in Siberia, I doubt if history will show any country in the world during the last 50 years where murder could be committed so safely and with less danger of punishment than in Siberia during the reign of Admiral Kolchak. So they really were up against absolute bastards. There are also fighters for national independence like the Poles, and then you've got independent militias of peasants known as the Greens, not the same as our Greens. And then you've got various sorts of complicated interventions by Britain, France, America, Japan, the Central Powers, which feeds the Soviet conviction that all opposition is a foreign plot.
It's madness. It's just absolute madness.
It's people flooding in. I mean, we could do a whole bit on kind of like Britain's role in this and America's role in this. It's chaos. So as you're suggesting the war accelerates the dictatorship. So that summer, a left socialist revolutionary fanatic assassinates the German ambassador in order to kick off a revolutionary war. So the Cheka arrests the entire party leadership, symbolically executes one of them, massive crackdown. This is the official one-party state, beginning of the one-party state. And then Lenin orders the execution of the Tsar and his family, who've been in prison since the revolution.
Yeah.
That's 7 Romanovs, 4 members of staff are shot dead in a basement and sulfuric acid poured on their faces before burial.
Including children.
Identification. I remember as a kid being obsessed with Anastasia. And
I mean, because the idea was, it's that classic thing of you can't allow, a future movement to build up around what would be seen, what they would see as the legitimate leaders. You have to kill the kids as well. But it is an act of absolute kind of barbarism and savagery that makes, the killing of the king during the French Revolution look like the height of civilization.
Trotsky wrote, and this was much later, this wasn't in the heat of the moment, the execution of the Tsar's family was needed not only to frighten, horrify and dishearten the enemy, but also in order to shake up our own ranks, to show them that there was no turning back, that ahead lay either complete victory or complete ruin.
Yes, which is this thing of like there'll be no one to rally around. But it's also indicative, isn't it, of the way that under the Civil War, that just this sense of savagery takes hold, which sort of ends up just defining the Russian Communist Party in power throughout. Mm-hmm. From that first moment, it's just this normalization of the killing of your fellow countrymen, this normalization of just like sort of hostage taking and mass murder and massacres. So the sort of start, it's like the blooding of the government is in this moment of just like absolutely abysmal horror. And that starts to become the manner in which it begins to operate in power.
Well, there's a real opportunism here, to use a popular Bolshevik insult. This is Lenin begins suppressing the kulaks, the wealthier peasants, using the war as an excuse. Orders hang and make sure that the hanging takes place in full view of the people. No fewer than 100 known kulaks, rich men, bloodsuckers. It doesn't really matter if they've done anything. It's who they are.
I think that quote gives you just a full indication of his moral character, right?
And I mean, the others are also very, very ruthless. So Trotsky, former anti-war activist, fully opposed to the First World War, now military leader, loves it. Loves his crisp uniform, his shiny boots, ordering people around. He's a very courageous and inspiring war leader. And one Bolshevik calls him the unceasing electrifier of a weakening army. And he's kind of the hero of the war. He knocks the Red Army into shape and thus basically defends the revolution. But no qualms about brutality. He controversially executes a group of deserters, continues to do this throughout the war. Writes a pamphlet called Terrorism and Communism to justify violence. The man who repudiates terrorism in principle must reject any idea of the political supremacy of the working class and its revolutionary dictatorship. So terror is fully justified and essential. But at the same time, he's sort of going, well, once socialism triumphs everywhere, there won't be any war. So it's sort of like that Fug song, Kill for Peace, because we want to create on this earth a real paradise for people. In the meantime, we've got to do all of this killing.
He literally sounds like Peacemaker in the Suicide Squad. It's just like, we want peace and I don't care how many people I have to kill to get it.
It's pretty much that. And then on the southern front, you've got Stalin, who is also a very brutal commander. So even though him and Trotsky hate each other, they're really quite similar. So we see these three characteristics of Stalin. One, he really enjoys killing. Like he actively is into it. Two, he doesn't care how many of his own men die in combat. This will be a feature of the Second World War. And three, he is a conspiracy theorist who thinks that every setback is down to a plot. It's down to sort of sabotage. And he constantly feels underappreciated. And even Bolsheviks are quite shocked by what's going on. Bukharin said during the war he saw things that I would not want even my enemies to see. And this was the period when we get phrases like enemies of the people and anti-Soviet elements really take off. That kind of the idea of the enemy within. Which, I mean, it was a civil war. And I'm not going to do the military history bit, because, but basically it got very, very hairy because you had Kolchak's army marching on Moscow. Then you had another general coming from Western Ukraine, another general moving in from Estonia and almost taking Petrograd. They're supported by Britain and France up to a point. There's mutinies, there's rebellions. I mean, so it's sort of not to sort of forgive the brutality, but if any situation was likely to license and inspire brutality,
yes,
it was probably the Civil War.
Yeah. I mean, both things can be true at the same time, right? The first thing is that this was part of their program. Terrorism, dictatorship, they've been very clear about it. They intended to install it. And that they themselves became more savage and cared even less about human life in the context of war than they would have done if the war had never taken place.
So by the end of the war, the total death toll from combat, executions, famine and disease is between 7 and 12 million. And a particularly sort of shocking fact here is that 5 million died from starvation exacerbated by war communism and control of the food supplies, which is not much less than the Holodomor in the 1930s.
Yeah.
But much less famous, or rather infamous. And Lenin says, this one absolutely fucking shocked me. He's talking about famine as a political opportunity to crack down on the church. It is now, and only now, when in the regions afflicted by the famine there is cannibalism and the roads are littered with hundreds, if not thousands of corpses, that we can, and therefore must, pursue the acquisition of church valuables with the most ferocious and merciless energy, stopping at nothing and suppressing all resistance. No other moment except that of desperate hunger will offer us such a mood among the broad peasant masses. I mean, that's like, I found that absolutely horrifying.
His just complete lack of even a trace of human empathy throughout this story. He simply does not possess the capacity for it. And we can say that that's because, the ideology has warped his mind or anything else, or it could just be a personal defect. He has no potential for human empathy.
But he was like that back when he was a young man, wasn't he? And there was that when he was a lawyer in that region where they were afflicted by a famine. And he was going, well, this is a good revolutionary opportunity, and opposed relief efforts. He didn't see humans as humans. I mean, that's not a political point. That just seems to be like a objective fact. That
yes.
They were just kind of, well, do they serve this purpose or not? And a death was no tragedy to him.
I'm going to jump in here and talk briefly about what causes that famine, because I think this is our first data point on the kind of like the economics of communism as it's being implemented. Like, they implement hard and fast. They instantly take away the right of private property. But this crucial part with the famine is the decision that was made to confiscate grain. You don't have to do that shit. Not under socialism, you don't. You could under socialism say, well, we'll just tax. We're going to have very heavy tax. You could have exorbitant taxation on peasants. You don't have to confiscate the grain. Now, because they confiscate the grain, they remove that aspect that we were talking about with capitalism that drives its efficiency, which is the profit motive, the sense of personal, improvement, of incentive for the individual. They also eradicate the pricing mechanism that we have for scarcity and demand of a commodity. Those core components are gone from the agricultural economy almost as soon as the Bolsheviks take over. Now, there are other things, obviously, that are responsible for the famine as well. Like, you're coming out of the First World War, you're in the middle of a civil war, and the terror itself that they've inflicted. But there is a lesson there about the economics of socialism, and that lesson is painfully earned. So before the revolution, Russia was the world's fourth largest exporter of grain. Okay? Almost as soon as the revolution takes place, grain and all other agricultural products just collapse. So you have 80.1 million tons of grain in 1913. It collapses to 46.5 million tons of grain in 1920, almost halving it. And then that leads directly to the famine, during which, as you say, there are sort of regions where cannibalism seems to almost sort of take over. There's one, historian Orlando Figes has got like very heavily documented cases for this. But, there's people just saying, like one local saying there are several cafeterias in the village and all of them serve up young children. That's the state that people are reduced to within a pretty short time of communist economics, admittedly in the context of civil war.
So obviously civil war has certain consequences. One is that, Bolshevism has shown that it is not just kind of weak and lucky, that is actually, can fight off this kind of resistance and cement its power. Two, it is utterly corrupting. Boris Souverin, a communist turned anti-Stalinist, who wrote one of the first biographies of Stalin, wrote, Bolshevism could not escape the psychosis of systematized murder. At the end of the Civil War, it was soaked in it. And another thing it does is it turns Trotsky into a national hero and therefore stokes his enemies' fear that he's going to be a more Napoleon. The more celebrated he becomes, the more resented he is. And because he doesn't really give a shit what colleagues think of him and he doesn't know how not to make enemies, he makes this worse for himself. So one thing Trotsky is responsible for, but later pretends that he wasn't responsible for, is the suppression of the Kronstadt rebellion. So, I mean, you're about to explain how the economics had to adapt to all of the disruption and misery and famine caused by the war. On 2nd of March 1921, sailors in Kronstadt, which is an island near Petrograd, where the Navy's garrisoned, mutiny, and they demand an end to one-party dictatorship. Now, these were the heroes of the revolution, and they're the same people. But what Lenin and Trotsky claim is that they're not the same people.
Right.
Like almost like they're either entirely different people, not the ones that just 4 years earlier were key to the revolution, or they're the same people that are being manipulated by foreign powers into bourgeois counter-revolution. And Trotsky is the driving force behind smearing them and then crushing the mutiny. Troops move in, the leaders are shot, the rest are sent to labor camps. And this becomes a symbolic watershed. We'll talk more about, I suppose, how certain people began to lose faith in the Soviet experiment. But this becomes a synonym later for the moment that they lost faith in the revolution. What was your Kronstadt? Was something that communists would ask each other. For disappointingly few people, Kronstadt was their Kronstadt.
Right.
But it became symbolic of the betrayal of the revolution. It was really early on. And this was something that when Trotsky wrote his memoirs and accounts of this period, did not talk about how he killed the sailors at Kronstadt.
Yeah, how surprising. The new economic policy in that same year, in 1921, is really where they step back from the most extreme application of socialist economics. Essentially a recognition of how badly it's gone, the confiscation of grain and what the consequences has been. Lenin calls it taking one step backwards to take two steps forward later on. The state continues to control large industries, banks and foreign trade. However, private individuals can now own small and medium-sized enterprises, and forced grain requisition is replaced by a tax on farmers. And that's payable in the form of agricultural product, later in a cash payment. Farmers are also able to sell their produce to the government. So here we have that mechanism, the price mechanism, the personal incentive mechanism of capitalism, the core principles by which capitalism operates, just spluttering back to life inside of the Soviet economy. There's an incentive to produce more grain. And so what do we see? We see agricultural product instantly jumps up 40%. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's almost like a complete vindication of that part of the capitalist argument of saying, like, no, you really do need market mechanisms to function. And when you don't have them, things start to go horribly wrong. By 1928, agricultural and industrial production has been restored to pre-World War I level. So that part of the economy, for now, and I emphasize that for now because it will not last, has now been returned to some kind of sense of sanity and of moderation of the socialist experiment. What has not, and what starts taking place, is really the social element of the socialist project. And this harks back to several of the points that we found in the sort of early socialist history. First one was, do you remember that quote from Babeuf? Babeuf was that guy operating during the French Revolution itself, when he put out the Manifesto for Equals, and the first sort of, written socialist documents. And it spoke gleefully of the loss of the enjoyments of the few, of solitary pleasures, of personal ease will cause lively regret. This is quite an unpopular sort of element of socialist thought, which is the leveling. This idea of like, everyone will be completely equal, but not only that, you won't really have a private life. We'll all be in this sort of communal part of life. Another element of that is the thing that we first as farce and then as tragedy. So reversing Engels' is sort of assessment of this stuff, which is the destruction of family life. Many of those old socialist experiments that you would see, Fourier didn't have it. He had private rooms for families in the commune. But actually, we found Owen did have it. And, there's this idea of we're going to start destroying the family, of saying, there will be no personal space for you to go back to. And the third element that we see from those early socialisms is this idea of eradicating the false consciousness of the individual, this idea of competition and individuality and all of that kind of stuff that comes from capitalism. Well, once socialism is here, we'll start to get rid of that. And that is the project that they now engage on.
So one of the listeners said, we mentioned false consciousness in episode 1 and said, can you explain what it is? I mean, broadly speaking, it is the idea that your true human nature has been kind of mangled and warped by capitalism, and therefore you can't see the world properly and you can't make the right decisions.
Exactly that. Exactly that. And so now the socialists are there in order to return humanity to its true sense of social consciousness, not individual, not egoism, not selfishness, but social consciousness. The Commissar for Education, Anatoly Lunacharsky, said, "The so-called sphere of private life cannot slip away from us because it is precisely here that the final goal of the revolution can be reached." The Russian historian Dmitry Volganov said this, "Perhaps the single most characteristic feature of the new society was its one-dimensionality, its uniformity. The infinite variety of social and intellectual life, culture, historical tradition, and the creative potential of millions of people was reduced to the harsh, uniform, uncompromising ideological paradigm of Leninism." It starts with education, with the purpose being of early Bolshevik thought is to nationalize the child, to remove the concept, and this is spoken of very explicitly by the Commissar for Education, to remove the sense of I, even the word I, from a child's vocabulary and replace it with a sense of we. Children are encouraged to form their own school police, to denounce fellow pupils, to hold trials of transgressors in classrooms, to hold marches and songs, to make oaths.
Well, Yevgeny Zamyatin wrote his dystopian novel We, precisely about that, in 1921, and various reasons, censorship and so on, it wasn't widely read outside Russia until I think the 40s. And people were really surprised that they thought he'd predicted this uniformity and surveillance that people associated with Stalin. They're like, how far-seeing he is. And he was somebody who literally left the Bolsheviks. He was a Bolshevik who quit the Bolsheviks, I think, because of Lenin. Once Lenin came back to Russia, he was just like, I don't like this. And he could see it really, really early on. And it's exactly that. And it's a big influence on many, many dystopian fictions afterwards. And so it was just interesting that so many readers assumed that he'd somehow predicted the future when, as you're saying,
it was happening.
It was happening.
Yeah. The idea of Fourier in the first episode of these lovely communes, everyone's making salad, and sleeping with each other. That is now regurgitated by the Bolshevik architectural planners, but in this kind of, it's as if like Clive Barker had been put in charge of doing it. So they bring up plans for commune houses, which obliterate all sense of privacy. At this point, on property, they are talking about annihilating private property to the point where you wouldn't even own your own underwear, where underwear would be held in common. People use this phrase, the abolition of private property, typically speaking in socialist thought, it's a very mercurial phrase. Typically speaking, what it refers to is we're going to take over the means of production, the land, the factories. It's not talking about, your T-shirts, your kids' toys, the family chicken. Here, they're talking, it's almost as if you're starting to talk about each object itself. There is no sense of personal ownership apart from the food that is in your mouth.
No one's touching my family chicken.
No one's ever wanted to, sir. Cooking and childcare on a rotating basis. Everyone's, not even sleeping in private, sleeping in dorm rooms with private rooms only reserved for sexual purposes. Actually, this early stage of Bolshevik thought, unlike later stages, is actually still quite sexually liberated. So this kind of idea that people would sleep around in a quite Fourier sort of way. Not many of those buildings are built, but the concept, the shared living concept, becomes standard for the urban population. This is the much luckier part of the Soviet population. Very small private spaces for sleeping, paper walls, everything else communal. An elder to run each one like a kind of mini dictatorship, watching over who's talking with who's washing at what time, and when they're doing it. One resident said, "It was a different feeling of repression from arrest, imprisonment, and exile, which I have also experienced, but in some ways it was worse. In exile, one preserved a sense of one's sense of self, but the repression that I felt in the communal apartment was the repression of my inner freedom and individuality."
Exile. Trotsky played croquet in exile.
Well, yeah, to be fair.
Worse than exile.
But that was the exile that was allowed to Bolsheviks before they took over the state.
Yeah.
The exile allowed to people that the Bolsheviks imposed on them once they took over the state was of a much more draconian.
No croquet?
Not so much on the croquet, more on the starving and the bitter earth. A word takes place here, a phrase which I think is incredibly telling, and it's called internal emigration. Mm-hmm. And it's that people just start to wear a mask of their own face. They know that they cannot reveal their inner disposition, so they put on a face completely disconnected from their internal life, and that is the retreat inside where any kind of lingering remnants of individuality can stay.
I just want to add a caveat there that, like you said, this is happening largely in sort of cities, close to the center of power. And so on the one hand, you've got this enforced uniformity, purges, show trials, censorship, the deportation of like intellectuals, writers, artists, scientists, free thinkers and all that. And I think we found the same writing about Mussolini and then with Hitler, is you have this idea of like everything is completely controlled, almost like Zamyatin's novel, right? There is no. But in reality, of course, there's all these problems. Like after the war and the Civil War, you've got really shaky transport and communications links. The Cheka is not that big. So what you've got in a larger country, which is fuels, I think, the increasing mania of dictatorship, is a load of Russians. They're indifferent or they're hostile towards communism. They're living relatively independently. The party membership is quite unstable. This pattern of like the idealists keep leaving after their Kronstadt, and then the opportunists join.
There's this constant fear of people putting on working class, inventing a working class heritage, putting on working class accents in order to secure party membership so they can get on in the world.
So it's sort of like, on the one hand, yes, it's trying to impose this kind of like iron dictatorship. And on the other hand, it is this vast country in which you simply cannot do that. And so there'll be whole villages with people that continue, right up to the Second World War, just continue to like hate the communists and are kind of going about their business when they're not having their grain requisitioned and so on. And so whenever you're talking about totalitarianism, which is not quite yet, but it's moving that way, there are these sort of practical limits. And so it's just remember that not everybody is living in the way that you described, because it's just, but not for want of trying.
Well, we just need to remember, this is not a predominantly urban country.
Yeah.
Okay, so what we're describing here is the urban conditions. What will be done to the countryside is, for a start, very much worse than this, and partly, I think, a reflection of what you're saying, that there's that sense of, well, how else do we bring this thing under control, this vast expanse where people can still be getting up to their own business, quite irrespective of what the Bolshevik Party might wish them to be doing.
And people will probably know this line. Associated with Lenin, as far as I could tell, it's from Bukharin in a 1921 speech, we need not be afraid of temporary disorganization. One cannot make omelettes without breaking eggs.
I mean, as a phrase, though, I wouldn't mind sticking it above my desk.
There's, because I've looked up a lot of the most sort of famous phrases, and it turns out some of them are completely dubious and unsourced.
Oh, really?
But that one, like he definitely said it. And it's true. But people are not eggs. I just want to point that out. Okay, so Lenin, as we're talking about, his health is in steep decline, and he wins one last crucial battle with Stalin. Stalin wants to incorporate all the Soviet republics into basically Russia, but Lenin insists on at least the appearance of national autonomy, a sort of phony federalism, hence the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Russians are actually only half the population. Inevitably, when we talk about this period, we always end up at some point slipping and saying Russia when we mean the Soviet Union.
You're right. It should be USSR, basically.
It's USSR. Yeah. So the hammer and sickle, which had been used as a decoration in 1918, was adopted as the official symbol in 1923. This is where we've got the USSR. But what's happening everywhere else, Ian? I'll tell you. So in March 1919, the Soviets form a third international. We talked about the first international, the one Marx was involved with, the second international, which was destroyed lasted a long time, but was destroyed by the First World War. And Lenin is insistent there has to be a world revolution, because we will soon see the birth of the World Federal Soviet Republic, because everybody's mad for socialism and revolution. Now, one of the issues that they face is they think socialism is too broad a church. We've discussed this, right? And they're not wrong, because basically And this is in our Origin Story Fascism book, if you'd like to read that. Before fascism comes along, socialism of some variety was sort of the only place for people who wanted radical change. With socialism, anarchism, syndicalism, but all in that kind of very broad sort of umbrella. Mussolini was a socialist until the war. The Nazi Party, as we know, starts off as the National Socialist. One French fascist said, nationalism plus socialism equals fascism. It's not quite that simple, but certainly that's what they thought.
Yeah.
And so the word socialism had become somewhat kind of tarnished, too vague. It's quite interesting. We obviously talk a lot about definitional problems, but they were very aware of this as well. So Bolshevik communism was this new category. This is the true socialism, and it is very loyal to Soviet Russia. Obviously, European socialists are very divided over the Bolsheviks. Some think that it is not socialism at all. It's just a terroristic dictatorship. Others think, well, you know what the Russians are like. This is regrettably necessary. And others are just like, they just love it. They love the dictatorship. So what the Comintern does is encourages the left wings of every socialist party in Europe to break off and form their own communist parties. This is when you get this flourishing of communist parties in America, in Britain, in Germany. Basically any Marxist who opposes the compromises of the Second International. So it splits the global left and it controls sort of half of it via the Comintern run by Zinoviev.
And he basically bars anyone from being a member of the Comintern if they have reformists in their party. It's essentially to say that debate that goes all the way through sort of socialist history, reform versus revolution, you are now absolutely in the code if you tolerate the presence of a single reformist within your organization.
Exactly. But before the Comintern comes along, the best hope of revolution in Europe has already failed. As I said, everybody was talking about Germany.
Yeah.
And this, I suppose you can put in terms of the tragedy of Rosa Luxemburg. Because when the army surrenders on the Western Front in November 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm abdicates, the Social Democrats take power. But Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, their Spartacus League, the anti-war socialist group, go, no, this is a revolutionary opportunity. So after the armistice and the abdication, Germany is this chaotic, violent place with clashes between workers and troops. And according to the chief of staff of the army at the time, a socialist revolution at Christmas might well have succeeded.
Right.
There was indeed an opportunity because the state was so weak and there was so much in flux. Unfortunately, at this point, the Spartacists are busy arguing about whether they should form a new party, and if so, whether they should call it socialist or communist.
Oh, God. Fuck.
So Luxembourg...
They went full Origin Story.
I know, right? This is it.
I mean, don't get distracted.
Don't just... That's for podcasts, guys, not for revolutionary situations. So Luxembourg wants to call it the Socialist Party, or Revolutionary Socialist Party, whatever, to distance themselves from the Bolsheviks. And she actually urges German delegates to Moscow to vote against creating the Comintern. But Liebknecht wants the word communist. He gets his way. The German Communist Party is born. And their activity prompts the government to bring in the far-right ex-soldiers of the Freikorps, who are basically proto-Nazis, aren't they? Right?
Yeah.
Simple as that, to defend Berlin. So on the 6th of January, the communists and some renegade social democrats declare a revolutionary committee and a temporary takeover of the government, call for a general strike. It is very improvised. It's very messy. It fails appallingly, and the Freikorps move in. So Luxembourg did not want to split the left. She didn't think that you could have a revolution without mass support. She didn't believe in that vanguard idea. She didn't support violence, but she ended up backing basically all three of these terrible ideas out of loyalty to her friends, momentum. She gets swept along against her better judgment. And it killed her. So on 15th of January, she and Liebknecht are separately arrested and murdered, and her body is thrown into a canal. And I think it's worth saying the reason why she is so revered on the left now is that I think she was principled and she failed. That once you've gone through, actually, Lenin was also a dictator.
Yeah.
Trotsky was also a brute. You were light on Luxembourg, who never had any power and represented another way between the Social Democrats and the Bolsheviks. How that would have panned out, if there was any possibility of her version of revolution happening, that seems unlikely. But that, I think, is why she is one of the communists of that period. And let's face it, she didn't really want to call herself a communist. That's what's ironic.
The thing is, we're not...
But she has got that nobility.
Because we're not Marxists. we have the capacity to assess people's character and personality and disposition alongside the historical circumstances in which they find themselves. And in her case, she is a much more open-minded, humanistic figure than we find there, non-terroristic, non-violent. So on that basis, no, I mean, it's not completely unreasonable to imagine a sunnier version of events. Who knows, right? But there are rational reasons that you can make her your beacon for a possible better past.
She was somebody that, doing the research, I was like, oh no, I don't really think she's been whitewashed. I think she was morally sound. I think her judgment was generally good. But I do think she fits into that category of people who are venerated because they never had power, and so we never saw what they're
probably. You remember when I was in the Socialist Workers' Party on Women's Day, they used to have special meetings for Rosa Luxemburg, and the banner they would put at the top is, "The greatest woman who ever lived." Because they're not one to do things by half.
Well, I mean, there's not a lot of women to choose from in the history of
socialism. Exactly. Yeah. They don't like talking about them very much, but she gets a pass.
So anyway, look, there are lots of other attempts. There is a Bavarian Soviet Republic, which is a fiasco. Hundreds of communists are killed. The Comintern sports 2 more failed revolutions in Germany in the early 1920s. At one point, Lenin has this berserk idea that the communists and the Freikorps, who hate the communists, should team up to bring down the government and then struggle for supremacy, which is kind of like a premonition of Stalin's terrible policy.
Yes. Oh God, it is. Yeah.
And this does not go down well with German communists at all. They don't do that. Hungary briefly gets a communist regime with Bela Kun overthrowing the government. He launches a Red Terror that is even worse than Lenin's. It was toppled after just 133 days. And because of the Civil War, the Russians aren't able to send any help, but Lenin considers Kun a lunatic anyway. It's like, it's so extreme. There's also a possibility of revolution in Italy in 1920, but the moment passes, which prompts Lenin's remarkable line, "Mussolini was the only one among you with the mind and temperament to make a revolution. Why did you allow him to leave?" There's one occasion where the Soviets try military force. Poland invades Ukraine. The Red Army kicks him out. Lenin decides to invade Poland in return. It fails. Stalin gets the blame and gets very resentful about this. We don't need to go into detail about this. The point is that various revolutions and even revolutions by military force fail. The only communist state in the world other than the USSR before 1945 is the Mongolian People's Republic.
Oh, wow.
And that's just because the Red Army at the end of the Civil War occupied Mongolia and turned it into a puppet regime. So it's essentially part of the USSR at that point.
I mean, the thing is also, this shit is not free. People are fucking starving to death in Russia. And Lenin is just, he's got Tsarist gold reserves. He's just shipping it overseas. He's not using it to, buy grain, right? Like, I mean, they're getting grain donated by the Americans to help them as a relief effort. But you're just shipping it, to the Communist Party of the USA, to the Communist Party of Japan, to the Communist Party of Turkey. That's how much you care about the people in your country, that this ideological fixation on the spread of the world revolution takes precedence over actual human lives.
Because they've given up really on the idea that there's going to be world revolution in the short term. So instead, they're building this network of communist parties loyal to Moscow. At the same time, they're actually signing like trade treaties with Britain and Germany. They're not trying to bring down the government, but they're kind of supporting the parties. Mostly, you'd have to say what the Comintern achieves is inspires Red Scares all over the world.
Right.
And then feeds the emergence of fascism as an anti-communist force. That this failed revolution in Italy is one of the reasons why the fascists are able to succeed there.
Yeah.
Because it's the spectre of the Reds.
It's not a conspiracy theory when they really are conspiring to do the thing that they say they're trying to do, which is to foment revolution in the home country. They are saying it, they are doing it. That is what's happening.
And unfortunately, they fail and the fascists succeed and communists are repressed. And we're going to talk more, I think, in the third episode about kind of communists around the world. So in 1922, one of Rosa Luxemburg's old friends publishes an unfinished pamphlet she wrote in 1918, a few months before she was murdered. And it is her take on the Russian Revolution. Socialism, by its very nature, cannot be dictated, introduced by command. Lenin is completely mistaken in the means he employs. Decree, the dictatorial power of a factory overseer, draconian penalties, rule by terror. Bear in mind, this is like mid-1918 she's writing this. Without general elections, without unrestricted freedom of press and assembly, without a free exchange of opinions, life dies out in every public institution. It is a dictatorship, not the dictatorship of the proletariat, but that of a handful of politicians.
This is why it's impossible to be too cynical about her, because she is like this, just this voice for the much more decent element of socialist history and socialist thought crying out, as things go in the other direction.
She knew, and I think, I'm fascinated by the different responses of kind of Western socialists, because I think that there is a very crude version which only concentrates on the people who seemed seemed like apologists or naive or whatever. Yes. So the American journalist Lincoln Steffens visits the USSR in 1919 and says, "I have seen the future and it works." Very famous line. You go, "Oh, you bloody idiot." Loads of people were coming along and thinking, well, this just seems absolutely wonderful. But the anarchist Emma Goldman, who actually wasn't visiting Russia because she was born there, she'd been deported to Russia during the Red Scare in America. She denounces it.
That's wonderfully ironic.
I know. And she's like, I know, this is awful. So she denounces it really early on. There's a very good scene, again, in the movie Reds here with Goldman and John Reed, author of 10 Days That Shook the World, who was also getting disillusioned before he died. Goldman wrote a very good short book about her disillusionment. And she says about Kronstadt, "Kronstadt broke the last thread that held me to the Bolsheviks. The wanton slaughter they had instigated spoke more eloquently against them than aught else. Whatever their pretenses in the past, the Bolsheviks now prove themselves the most pernicious enemies of the revolution." You also get two of Britain's biggest writers come to Russia. They both give Lenin a fair hearing, but then write pretty damning books about him, which and say, look, this is absolutely not what we need in Britain. So H.G. Wells gets a bit of criticism for calling Lenin an amazing little man.
Cost a coffee stamp.
Exactly. When he visits Moscow in September 1920. But then he was in some ways an amazing little man. It's not a moral judgment. He also thinks,
which word is wrong?
I know, right?
Is he a man?
Is he? Yes. Little, I don't know, compared to H.G. Wells, amazing in some ways. But he also thinks that Lenin's denial about the challenges. He is like a tetchy housewife who wants you to recognize that everything is in perfect order in the middle of an eviction.
That's very funny.
It's always a delight to turn to these, from the Marxist writers to the Wells, and indeed to Bertrand Russell. Makes a similar visit around the same time. And he says, "The revolution is one of the great heroic events of the world's history. But it's already failed because of its methods. They think the proletariat means proletariat, but dictatorship does not quite mean dictatorship. This is the opposite of the truth." And he argues, again, ahead of his time, that the failure of Bolshevism will discredit socialism as a whole.
Yeah, my God.
And that the conspiracy of concealment by Western socialists will enable this tarnishing to go on.
See, at this point in his life, Bertrand Russell was actually really quite sympathetic towards anarchism. But, we think of him as a liberal, but actually at this point he was flirting pretty heavily with anarchism. When you read his book on these subjects, you can see that the anarchism stuff is the stuff that excites him.
Yeah.
So again, it's almost like, I'd like to claim him for the liberal critique, but actually what's funny is, again, we see that process that's been happening really since Marx's time, that the most cogent, the most acute, the most forensic criticisms of communism come from anarchists, from people within the tent
like Goldman,
rather than those outside. Yeah. So starting in 1921, Lenin's health begins to decline. He has a series of strokes, and in between them he's experiencing sort of headaches, fatigue, paralysis, impaired speech and cognition, irritability, anxiety, depression, obsessive behavior. I think the trouble with both of there's these sort of medical debates afterwards, with Stalin as well as Lenin, going, oh, was it impairing their... I think the way that they govern in this period is pretty much exactly the same as the way that they were governing before, which is...
Some irritability.
Exactly.
It's something you could say about Lenin throughout his entire life.
Paranoia, irritability. You're like, well, who can tell the fucking difference? So maybe it impaired his ability to govern, but he was like this before. So it's very hard to tell that. But what does happen is that slowly but surely over the next sort of 2-3 years, a vacuum of power develops at the height of Russian politics. And around that vacuum, a soap opera develops. The exact details of which we're not going to bore you with because it is very, very boring indeed.
Who are the stars of the soap opera?
The stars of the soap opera are Lenin himself, Stalin himself, and Trotsky himself, the three main characters that we're covering here, as well as Zinoviev and Kamenev. So Zinoviev and Kamenev, they're very affectionate. They're always together. You'll always see them mentioned together in this capacity. Kamenev is much more courageous. Zinoviev is actually quite cowardly. They're going to come up now in this discussion. It is basically as this sort of one unit that gets tossed around different parts of the power functions around the Politburo, taking one side or another, either against Trotsky or against Stalin, and bounced around until eventually they are killed. Sorry for the spoilers that come in a few decades' time, but this whole, soap opera game doesn't work out too well for them. In every stage, this dispute in the Politburo is discussed, typically of like rightists and leftists. Rightists essentially being another word for moderation. Do you want to slow things down? Are you a little bit NEP, new economic policy? Do you think maybe we need some sort of, some market mechanisms? Or are you one that thinks that we just need to be as, as full-throated and aggressive in our communism as possible? But the truth is, everyone's bouncing from leftists to rightists to leftists to rightists over and over again. I mean, there's loads of period where Stalin is the most rightist figure that's available, and then they'll flip over. It's because this is not really based on any kind of meaningful dispute. This is essentially based on people grasping for power.
Well, when we were searching centrism, the most remarkable discovery was the fact that Stalin at this point was described as the centrist.
Yeah, exactly.
Between the sort of squabbling of Trotsky on the left and Bukharin on the right. And
right.
And you just think, okay, that's not a word that of all the people in the world, apart from maybe Hitler, I think Stalin would be the least likely centrist. But so he was. And like you said, it's more about positioning within the party power structure than it is about strong principles. But
this is a point where you can actually start saying something useful about Marxism, right? Because none of that shit should have been happening. And when we talked about the reductionism in Marxism, it's all power is fundamentally economic, and all this other stuff, whether it's, race or identity, none of that's kind of, of any pertinence and will go away once we fix the private property. Well, the thing is, they have fixed the private property stuff. They have actually abolished private property in a really quite considerable way. You can't accuse them of not seeing through the project. And yet, what do we see at the top? We see non-economic power based on personality, on ambition, on intrigue, on charisma, on paranoia, on having power bases around middle management. All these quite mercurial, sort of intangible forms of power that we don't really think about very often. Well, actually, they become the chief meat and potatoes of day-to-day political activity.
Where Lenin, I think, is sharp is he identifies Stalin as a real contender. Partly because he's increasingly frustrated with him and angry with him. But a lot of people are sort of putting him like maybe a distant fifth, in the sort of runners and riders. He's not the obvious contender to succeed Lenin, but Lenin can see his strengths and see his ambition, because Stalin is still underrated at this point.
He is. I mean, the key point for Stalin is 1922 when he is appointed the general secretary of the Central Committee. And at that point, it's like, okay, so shit, you've got like a good, decent power base behind you.
Yeah.
The memories of him completely catastrophically fucking up in Civil War notwithstanding, is increasingly seen as someone who can deal with crises when they come up. And he starts coordinating against Trotsky. This is his point of thinking, like, you know what, Trotsky is the main danger. He's always been incredibly envious, jealous of him and his skills. So with Kamenev and with Zinoviev, he starts grouping. They form a troika, the three of them, against Trotsky. And Lenin at that point is mostly on their side. He's sort of, is taken against Trotsky himself. Then things flip over. Lenin starts saying, as you're saying, Stalin's actually the danger now.
Yeah.
There's this crucial phone call. It's autumn 1922. Lenin's trying to bring Trotsky out of disfavor and work with him and wants to set up a speech where he'll attack the Troika. Stalin refuses to schedule that speech and calls up Lenin's wife and just starts shouting at her down the phone. Now that turned out to be a very, very bad decision indeed, because it pisses Lenin off no end. December 1922, this is months later, Lenin just clearly brooding on this shit. He writes a letter to the Congress. Comrade Stalin, now that he is General Secretary, has concentrated immense power in his hands, and I'm not sure whether he will always be capable of exercising this power with sufficient caution. A month passes, January 1923. He proposes removing Stalin from the General Secretary post because he is, quote, too rude. 2 months pass, March 1923, and now several months away from the original incident. He writes a letter to Stalin. Dear comrade, you were so ill-mannered as to call my wife to the telephone and scold her. I have no intention of forgetting what has been done against me, and it goes without saying that what you have done against my wife is also done against me. It's proper soap opera.
It's strong energy. Really... Did you call my wife a prostitute in the comment section of the Plymouth Herald?
It really is that. I mean, and like it's at that point you're on the verge where it's just like the Politburo is basically like, oh, that's it. Well, it's coming now. Internal war, within the Politburo. Like it's quite clear it's about to go to war. And at that point, that's basically one of the final written pieces of communication Lenin ever does, because his health suddenly collapses. He has a third stroke and he loses the ability to speak. He doesn't die, but he loses the ability to speak. And that campaign against Stalin doesn't really take off.
Well, at one point, that the arguing between Stalin and Trotsky is so bad and Lenin is so ill that the Politburo never actually goes ahead with this, but seriously contemplates printing a fake issue of Pravda, especially to give to Lenin.
Oh, wow.
So that he doesn't know about it and try and get involved, which he would, even though he was so incapacitated. He'd want to sort of get involved. So they were just going to do one, just going, with a picture. Stalin and Trotsky, best friends. Just a special edition of Good News.
Lenin dies on the 21st of January, 1924. He falls into a coma at the age of 53. After all that work to try and secure power, he gets 3 years, really? From the revolution of having it. Yeah, exactly. He lives longer than that, but for the last part, he's completely out of it. And even before then, you look at some of the photos of him and he looks increasingly wild-eyed and not present. Let's just put it that way. Initially, it was just going to be a kind of a bog standard sort of burial. He, of his many flaws, grandeur was not one of them. He didn't like monuments. He didn't want them erected to him. He was quite uncomfortable with the hero worship. He didn't really stop it, but he was uncomfortable with the growing hero worship around him. I think Churchill got it right when he said of the Russian people, their worst misfortune was Lenin's birth, their next worst, his death.
Oh my God.
Because it was incredible. It's as soon as he dies, it's like the Leninization of Russian society. He's turned into a cult. He's spread the monuments, the statues go up, in every country.
Oh, yeah.
You got this huge, it takes a few years, but this huge mausoleum built. He is mummified. In the end, after a few years, there's 27 scientists and 33 technicians working night and day just to prevent, peeling of the nose, marks on the skin, deformation of the dermis. He is essentially turned into some kind of god.
I've seen it.
Oh, how was that?
Kind of fascinating but weird.
Right. I mean, I guess I would have expected that.
It's exactly as you'd expect, and you're all queuing up to see this embalmed corpse. It just felt like one of those things that one should do when in Moscow.
Yeah, I mean, how would you?
This was some years ago, by the way, before anybody starts having a go at me. This was quite a long time ago.
This is very weird for his wife, by the way, because she protests against all of this stuff, the building of mausoleums, very consistently. She dies in 1939, and she very rarely goes to see this mummified version of him. The last time she does, February before her death, she says, he's just the same, but look how I've aged. You never think how weird it must be for the family member, for the spouse of someone who's been mummified. You just have to keep on seeing them maintained at that exact position.
What they're also doing is this sort of revisionism.
Yeah.
Right? Because he needs to be a saint. This is when Petrograd becomes Leningrad. they're rewriting his backgrounds. The fact that he was from quite a well-off family, that goes out the window.
Right.
His ties to those kind of Narodniks, the agrarian socialists, let's not talk about that. His debt to any other thinkers other than Marx, being really like Machiavelli and von Clausewitz. No. And this is when we get a word that Lenin never actually used, Marxism-Leninism.
Oh.
This is Stalin using this. And, Stalin is going, well, of course, me and Lenin were very, very, very close. And Trotsky writes his own book on Lenin, in which, amazingly, Trotsky was Lenin's best friend. They were all like sort of fighting over this holy man who obviously, they had long periods of disagreement with, including some very, very recently, literally like in months before he died.
He was so much more useful to them dead than he was alive, especially at this stage.
But Marxism-Leninism, we should just take a minute, becomes the dominant form of Marxism.
Yeah.
In the 20th century. The OED, sorry, I know it's a bit of a shock to drop the OED in the middle of an episode.
I don't know what the fuck you did. This is madness.
I have been drinking. The OED says, the political ideology which merges Marx's analysis of capitalism with Lenin's theories of revolutionary action and stresses the role of the central institutions of the Communist Party in controlling and organizing the political and economic life of a state. And I think that's sort of fair enough. I mean, we've talked quite a lot about how Lenin adapted Marxism, but that's the point. So when we talk about, the power of Marxism in the 20th century, it's sort of really the power of Marxism-Leninism because of that weird situation of all the failed revolutions, and you've only got the Soviet Union and Mongolia.
Yeah.
Which is a puppet of the Soviet Union. That is the only version of Marxism that succeeds for the first half, pretty much the first half of the 20th century. And it's his. Okay, so basically, again, it's more soap opera antics because Stalin gets the upper hand in the succession fight because Zinoviev and Kamenev don't want to help Trotsky. His admirers don't seem to accept that he just doesn't want to do the boring stuff of running things.
Right.
He's just not that guy. Stalin, in some ways, quite a boring guy. He was very happy to do the behind-the-scenes stuff.
Yeah.
Whereas Trotsky is more just like he wants to get out there, leading the troops or giving the great speech. He's not an administrator. So Trotsky, big divide here. He still insists that communism can't be achieved until the whole world has had a socialist revolution, while Stalin talks about building socialism in one country. Now, if you are a citizen of the Soviet Union and you want stability and prosperity and not revolution and war, which one are you going to go for? Hence, Stalin is seen as the moderate. Isaac Deutscher, Trotsky's biographer, said that Stalin posed as the man of the golden mean.
Wow. Jesus.
What? Stalin the centrist again.
That's proper centrist language here.
So yeah, the attacks on Trotsky heat up. He's an enemy of Bolshevism, yada, yada, yada. He's defeated in 24. In 25, Stalin's bullying causes a new split. So now it's Stalin and Bukharin versus Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Trotsky. But Stalin basically controls the party apparatus, the media. It's not a fair fight at all. There are all these purges, not just in the Soviet Union, but in the Comintern, where, you get kicked out of the Communist Party abroad if you don't support Stalin. Trotsky just blows up at Stalin. It's quite a ballsy move. He calls him to his face the gravedigger of the party and the revolution. Stalin subsequently shouts at him, "You're a pathetic individual, entirely robbed of any elementary sense of truth, a coward and a bankrupt, a rascal and a villain who has indulged in saying things that absolutely fail to correspond to reality."
I can't wait when this season is over to not have to hear any more Marxist invective.
I know.
Because it's
what they do. You're foul, pathetic rascal.
I know. You can see the veins bulge on the neck. And there's never any wit to it. There's never any scalpel. You know what I mean?
No.
All you take is a hammer.
It's not like, Wells comparing someone to like a
Exactly.
tetchy housewife or whatever. It's just like, you are the foulest blackguard and scoundrel, deviationist. All these fucking insults start, just established by this Marxist-Leninist period. So things come to a head on the 10th anniversary of the revolution when the united opposition, which is on the left, finally expelled from the party. Kamenev and Zinoviev crawl back a few months later, but Trotsky refuses to apologize. So Stalin exiles him to Kazakhstan, and the exile years begin. And then finally, in December 1928, the Ogpu, which is what the Cheka is called now, and I think when they said it out loud enough times, they were like, we just cannot instill fear by being called the Ogpu. So that's why they became the NKVD.
We need a new acronym.
We need a new acronym. Jesus, man, did nobody say this out loud? So they tell Trotsky, look, you've got to knock off the criticism or be deported. Being Trotsky, he refuses to back down. So February 1929, he's expelled from the country that he helped to build and bundle into a ship to Turkey. And Bukharin, still fighting away with his so-called right deviation, also inevitably crushed. So it seems like such a familiar story that you go, well, this person could have been stopped, but the people who could have stopped him were too vain, squabbling, incompetent. They couldn't do it. But it was not as if like he couldn't have been stopped before he had all of the machinery of power.
Sporadically, they think that they do need to stop him. You know, Zinoviev, Kamenev, there's moments where they're like, no, you know what, we actually do have to stop Stalin, he's a real threat. And then he'll use like some kind of debate motion to turn the tides, or they'll think, no, actually, you know, the bigger threat is Trotsky, we need to do that. Over and over, you see a pattern with Stalin's behavior, starting here and then going on through his career, of people in the Politburo just sort of think, instead of standing up to him when he attacks, just thinking, just, you know what, just bunker down, hope it passes over you and you're not the one targeted. So, you know, offer these expressions of fealty and loyalty and admiration for him in a way that is frankly not too dissimilar from what Donald Trump asked for from the people around him, in the hope that you will be safe and that the spotlight doesn't turn as what will either become a ritual humiliation or the extermination of you and your family starts to wheel its way around. For the time being, like they, you know, we can call them, sometimes they're called rightists, or sometimes they're called, predominantly oppositionists. Increasingly, they're just called the enemy. Yeah. Like these names, essentially, there was no political content to that dispute. It's really, are you opposed to Stalin? Are you capable of criticizing him? Do you pose even the most remote threat to him? And at this stage, he is now completely ascendant. He's managed to maneuver things. So there are very, very few obstacles to his power. And those who did or could have stood up to it are starting to fall by the wayside.
And this is why, you know, it seemed that it was petty going, oh, Trotsky was really obnoxious in meetings. But I mean, this is the problem. This is where it pays off, that if you are brilliant but vain and obnoxious, then when you need allies, you're not going to have them. And he lacked a certain ruthlessness, and he lacked coalition building skills, because it wasn't as if Stalin was a particularly popular. He wasn't popular, he wasn't charismatic, he wasn't charming, but he knew how power worked. And that's what it comes down to. It is almost that classic, you know, people say history is split into sort of the Roundheads and the Cavaliers.
Yeah, yeah.
And Stalin was the classic Roundhead, and Trotsky was the big flouncy Cavalier who ends up, well, I'm not going to say where he ends up, but not running the Soviet Union. I can tell you that for nothing.
Stalin is now effectively in control. I mean, there is no point, you know, there's no date that he becomes like the chancellor, you know, as you would have seen, like, you know, that's not how it works here. He's, you know, the job position doesn't really matter, but he is now utterly ascendant. And he will go on to do things that are some of the, you know, the most famous instances of communist tyranny, far more famous than the stuff that we've discussed in this episode. And people from this stage will start to see this point in time as the big dividing moment between, you know, the hopes and aspirations of the revolution and, you know, the Stalinist terror that comes afterwards. The honest truth is that the apparatus, the practical apparatus, and the emotional space and the ideological convictions and the social norms have all been established in this period that we've discussed this episode. He will do things that are far more extreme than anything we've seen this episode.
Yeah.
But all of the weapons he needs are to hand and were put to hand by the Leninist regime that preceded him.
Yes, you can say, oh my God, he was a psychopath, but all the tools that the psychopath needed had been established by then. Thanks for listening to Origin Story, everybody. You can find our sources in the show notes and give us feedback via the Patreon page or on Blue Sky. We're doing something a bit different. Normally, we put all the sources for all the episodes in one big sort of block on each episode. But I think because this is a 3-parter, we've kind of divided them up so it's a little more digestible. And if you'd like to help keep us reading and recording, you can support us on Patreon.
As you can see, I can't even begin to describe to you the amount of work that has gone into this 3-parter. I mean, surely at this point, this is the most work that we've ever put into it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
It's been a fucking nightmare. So, look, if you wish to have things where people try to explain things without tribalism and irrationality or hatred, while always being fair and trying to entangle like the lessons that we can have for our present, essentially old, unfashionable Enlightenment values about understanding the world around you rather than the rampaging paranoia and screaming that constitutes our modern discourse, then it would be very nice if you could financially support us so we could continue to do this and bring this to more people.
Well, this is a good example because obviously in your research you come across sort of Marxist versions of this history and very conservative anti-communist versions. And it is like important to try and, to sort of come in with a sense of fairness. I mean, obviously, we've come away rather critical of the people who established the dictatorship. But I think trying to do that thing which is not partisan is the effort.
Hopefully people with experience at this podcast will realize that we're fair, often enough that when we speak this way, it's because it's a really very comprehensive case indeed against these motherfuckers. And that's what it is. Yeah. You will also get free mugs, some episodes that we do entirely for patrons. You'll get each episode a week in advance. You'll get money off our live shows and you'll get access to our Patreon community.
So we've got new mugs and a live show coming up. And if you just don't want any of those things, then you can at least tell a friend or give us a review on a podcast app or print up some Origin Story stickers that you put in prominent places or get a bullhorn and shout about it from in a public square. Really just any way that you tattoo the logo onto a shaved dog and send it running around the town.
Jesus Christ.
Just any way that you can help promote this podcast, we very appreciate it.
Guys, we will see you next week for the third and final episode, Terror.